Welcome to Lecture 1 on Kant's philosophy of the self in the critique of pure reason. Back in the 1980s, I studied philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and in the spring of 1984, I took Professor Wolf's seminar on Kant's critique of pure reason. And as you know, Professor Robert Paul Wolf is a distinct Kantian, and under his direction, I wrote a thesis entitled Kant's Philosophy of the Self. I completed it in 1987, but over 30 years, I have not made it public. But about 8 weeks ago, a friend of mine told me that, hey, your thesis is on internet, and more than 5,000 have people read it. I go, what? I never put it on internet. Well, someone just put it on internet, and I was kind of disappointed because I was thinking of publishing it, and I didn't want to make my thesis in public until it's published. Now, why my thesis, Kant's Philosophy of the Self, went on internet? It's a long story. I can't really explain it now. But a friend of mine also suggested me that since more than 5,000 people have read it, instead of what I should do is, instead of taking it down, I should make my own presentations on my own writing. So I took his advice, and I decided to go on YouTube, because I'm the one who wrote Kant's Philosophy of the Self, and it's a very good thesis, and I thought I should make make presentations on my own thesis instead of having other people interpreting it. Because if 5,000 people, well, actually by today, more than 6,000 people have read it. Well, today is July 4th, Independence Day. So I'm kind of pleased that I can start this lecture on Independence Day. Anyway, I really don't want, if more than 6,000 people have read your book or your writing, and some of them might misunderstand what you want to say. And to me, I mean, some of the 6,000 readers of my thesis maybe have misunderstood what I want to say. So I decide to make my own presentations, and I present my explanations of my writing, Kant's Philosophy of the Self. Okay, that was very good writing. Now, my thesis is focused on the transcendental deduction of categories. The transcendental deduction of categories is the core of the critique of pure reason. And the critique of pure reason is the most difficult book ever written by the humankind. And in the critique, the transcendental deduction of the category is the most difficult part. But don't hesitate to read them. I mean, without understanding the transcendental deduction of categories, you will understand nothing about Kant. Now, deduction of categories. There are metaphysical deduction of categories and transcendental deduction of categories. Transcendental deduction of categories is one of the only two parts Kant rewrote for his second edition. The parts of the critique of pure reason Kant rewrote was the transcendental deduction of categories and the paralogism of reasons. Now, transcendental deduction of the categories in the original edition is called deduction A, and one in the second edition is called B deduction. Okay? Now, so there are metaphysical deduction of categories and transcendental deduction of categories, and transcendental deduction of categories A, transcendental deduction of categories B, and the transcendental deduction of categories is composed of the subjective deduction and objective deduction. And the B deduction has only objective deduction. That's what you have to know. Well, I assume the people who view my presentations is that you have my thesis, Kant's philosophy of the self, right in front of you, and also you are fairly familiar with a critique of pure reason. If you have never read the critique of pure reason, and you haven't read my thesis, I mean, you will really understand nothing what I will say for the next 6 months. Okay? So now, there are many ways to interpret Kant's critique of pure reason. In the English-speaking countries, P.F. Strawson's The Bounds of Sense is probably the most popular book on Kant. Now, my teacher, or my former teacher, Professor Robert Paul Wolff, wrote a book, Kant's Theory of Mental Activity. It was published by Harvard back in 1963. And that was 3 years before Strawson published The Bounds of Sense. Strawson published The Bounds of Sense in 1966. Bob Wolff published his Kant's Theory of Mental Activity in 1963. One of the reasons why Professor Wolff published Kant's Theory of Mental Activity is, I mean, the object of his book was pretty much to refute the bounds of sense. Now, Bob Wolff studied with Peter Strawson for 1 year back in 1954 or something. I'm not sure. But now, Bob Wolff's interpretation and Strawson's interpretation are the mirror opposite. They're as good. They're both very good, and they're very different. And since I was a student of Bob Wolff, my way of understanding Kant is a lot like Bob Wolff's as opposed to P.F. Strawson's. So now, for Professor Wolff and myself, synthetic activity of the self, activity of the mind, subject, is the most important thing in the critique of pure reason. But Strawson says synthetic activity of the mind or function of the subject, I mean, the whole transcendental idealism or transcendental psychology are just junks. I mean, well, he doesn't call it junk. I mean, he doesn't say the deplorable, but he just said, I mean, transcendental psychology or transcendental idealism is just academic fantasy. I don't think so. I think transcendental psychology or transcendental idealism is the most important thing in the critique of pure reason. Now, well, the differences between my interpretation and Strawson's interpretation, or the difference between Bob Wolff's interpretation and Strawson's interpretation, is that the difference to look at the things in themselves. Now, for Strawson, we have knowledge of appearances. Now, we have knowledge of appearances of what? We have knowledge of appearances of things in themselves. For Strawson, the things in themselves affect our sensibility, and we know things in themselves as we are affected by them. So the knowledge we have of appearances is appearances of things in themselves. So for Strawson, appearances are pretty much the joint product of sensibility and things in themselves. But my teacher, Bob Wolff, said, no. We do not have knowledge of appearances of things in themselves. We cannot know things in themselves in any way whatsoever. We cannot even know things in themselves as they appear. So what are the appearances? appearance is nothing but appearances. We have appearances. When we say we know appearances, we have knowledge or we have cognition of appearances. We have knowledge of appearances of appearances, and we never know appearances of things in themselves. Why? Because things in themselves never appear. Things in themselves are non-sensible objects. Non-sensible objects can never be given to your sensibility. What cannot be given to your sensibility can never be known. See? Kant requires both sensibility and understanding to know, to have knowledge, but if something like thing in itself, which never affects your sensibility, was things in themselves which are not sensible, can never be sensed. If they can never be sensed, they can never be intuited. If they never can be intuited, they can never be conceived. So it really doesn't make sense that Strawson says we have knowledge of appearances of things in themselves. Now, P.F. Strawson is a very analytic philosopher, and H.J. Payton, who is not as analytic as Strawson, said in Kant's Metaphysics of Experience, or he said metaphysic of experience instead of metaphysics of experience. But anyway, H.J. Payton also says, we don't know things as they are in themselves, but we know things as they appear to us. Namely, we do know appearances of things in themselves. So H.J. Payton's view of things in themselves is a lot like P.F. Strawson's. Now, I'm not accusing Strawson. I mean, he's a very distinct philosopher. I mean, he's one of the best Kantian, I think. I don't know if he's a Kantian, but I mean, The Bounds of Sense is a very intellectual book. And although any of you who has read it must be impressed with it. But the thing is, what he does in The Bounds of Sense is descriptive metaphysics. Now, Strawson himself never uses the term descriptive metaphysics in The Bounds of Sense. He uses it in Individuals. He published in the Individuals in 1959. That's where he introduced the term descriptive metaphysics. Now, he applied that method of descriptive metaphysics to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and wrote The Bounds of Sense. And Bob Wolff, my teacher, who was a student of C.I. Lewis at Harvard, he had 3 degrees from Harvard. And after he got a master's from Harvard in the 1954, I think, he went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and studied with P.F. Strawson. And he was pretty upset because the way Strawson taught Critique of Pure Reason was so much different from the way C.I. Lewis taught. So he went back to the States, to Boston, after a year in Oxford. He wrote the Kant's Theory of Mental Activity. That was his dissertation from Harvard. And he published in 1963. And many of you have read it. I've read it. Very good book. And I agree with what's said in Kant's Theory of Mental Activity, and I disagree with what Strawson says in The Bounds of Sense. So what Professor Wolff did in his dissertation, which is Kant's Theory of Mental Activity, was to have Kemp Smith on the one hand and H.J. Payton on the other, and compare the two. And that's how he wrote the book. Now, I wrote Kant's Philosophy of Self. To write it, I had Kant's Theory of Mental Activity on the one hand and The Bounds of Sense on the other, and I compared the two. And that's how I wrote Kant's Philosophy of Self. And it was completed in 1987, and it went on internet April 2017. without my consent. But you know, it only it, I mean, already 5,000 people. Actually, as of today, July 4th, Independence Day, more than 6,000 people. More than I don't know if they're all Americans. I mean, I don't think it's all the 6,000 people who read my thesis are Americans. I mean, it's read in the United Kingdom as well as in the United States. But since 6,000 people have read it, as I said in the beginning, instead of taking it down, I thought I should make my own presentations on my own thesis. Now, as my thesis, Kant's philosophy of the self is composed of 8 chapters, I will talk about my thesis chapter by chapter. So I assume there will be 8 lectures on this series. I don't know, there might be 9. I mean, Professor Wolf made 9 lectures, so I might as well give 9 lectures. I don't know. We have to know how things go. Now, let me see my thesis. I wrote it more than 30 years ago, so some of the things. So it starts with introduction, then chapter 2 on inner sense and the self in itself. That's an important chapter. And I, excuse me, I explained in chapter 2 the difference between Descartes and Kant. For Descartes, my own existence is known for sure. And the existence of bodies, including my own body, is inferred from the knowledge of myself. Kant says no. For Descartes, mind is better known than the body. But for Kant, mind is as well known as the bodies. Well, it's kind of strange to say, maybe. But the mind or soul is not any better known than the bodies. Because to know oneself, to know myself, I have to know the things in space. Now, there are again 2 ways to interpret about things in themselves. Kant, in the A deduction, namely transcendental deduction of the categories in the original edition of the 1781, he talks about things outside us. And he clearly says things outside us are not things in themselves. Things outside us are things in space. Okay? Did I say it right? No, Kant says things outside us are not things in themselves. Things outside us are things in space. So when Kant says things affect us, it's not that things in themselves affect us. Things in space affect us. Namely, appearance affect us. So what we know are the appearances of appearances, not appearances of things in themselves. That's clear. Well, that's very difficult to understand, maybe. Now, this is just an introduction, and from the second lecture, which may come out next week, next month. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm pretty busy, and I can't give a lecture every week. I mean, when I have lots of time, maybe I'll give a lecture every week. But after this, I might have to wait for another month to give you a lecture too. I mean, how we go on, we'll see. Because sometimes I can give lectures every week, but sometimes after I give my lecture, you might have to wait for a few weeks or for a month for the next lecture. So I can't really guarantee, and I can't really promise when lecture 2 of the series will be up on YouTube, but from lecture 2 on, I'll explain Kant's philosophy in more detail. So this is today, Independence Day. It's just a introduction day, and I couldn't say much. But from next week on, or maybe from next month on, I'll give you lectures in more detail. So look forward to it. I'll see you again.